When I handed over the keys to our family beach house to my son after my husband's death, I thought I was giving him a gift. Instead, his wife made me sleep in the storage shed like a vagrant while they hosted dinner parties in the home I'd maintained for 30 years. But one phone call changed everything. And what happened next will shock you. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Williams. Though everyone's called me Peggy since I was 5 years old and couldn't pronounce my own name properly. I'm 72 years old, a recent widow, and apparently now homeless, according to my daughter-in-law, who seems to think kindness is a limited resource that shouldn't be wasted on family. The morning I signed over the deed to our Malibu beach house, the salt air felt different somehow, like it was already saying goodbye. Richard had been gone for 6 months and the house felt too big, too quiet, too full of memories. That made my chest ache every time I walked past his reading chair or caught a whiff of his cologne still lingering in the master bedroom closet. The mortgage was paid off, the property taxes were manageable, but the loneliness was suffocating me like fog rolling in from the ocean. My son Marcus called it a generous gesture when I told him I wanted to sign the house over to him and his wife Victoria. He said it would help them build equity, give their twin daughters a place to make summer memories, and ensure the house stayed in the family for generations. What he didn't mention was that Victoria had been eyeing that property like a hawk circling roadkill ever since she married into our family 8 years ago. The signing took place at a lawyer's office in Beverly Hills, all marble floors and leather chairs that probably cost more than most people's cars. Victoria wore a cream-colored blazer and pearls, looking like she was auditioning for a country club board position rather than accepting a $1 million gift. She barely made eye contact with me during the entire process, just signed papers and checked her phone like she had somewhere more important to be. Marcus seemed nervous, fidgeting with his wedding ring, and asking the lawyer unnecessary questions about property taxes and insurance transfer. I should have paid more attention to that nervousness. Should have asked why a man receiving such a generous gift looked like he was attending his own execution. But I was focused on the relief I felt, the weight lifting off my shoulders as I imagined myself in a cozy apartment somewhere, maybe closer to my sister in San Diego, starting fresh without Richard's ghost haunting every corner. The lawyer handed me a copy of the transfer documents, and I folded them carefully into my purse next to a tissue packet and a roll of peppermint. Victoria finally looked at me then, her smile sharp as broken glass, and said thank you in a tone that suggested she was doing me the favor by accepting my generosity. I hugged Marcus goodbye, breathing in the familiar scent of his aftershave that reminded me so much of Richard, and told him I'd start looking for a new place right away. That was my first mistake, assuming I had time to find somewhere else to live. The call came 3 days later, while I was sorting through Richard's clothes, deciding what to donate and what to keep for sentimental reasons. Victoria's voice was crisp and businesslike, the way she spoke to service workers and telemarketers, as she informed me that they'd decided to move in immediately. The girls were starting at a new school in the fall, she explained, and they needed to get settled before the chaos of a new academic year began. I asked about the timeline, thinking surely they'd give me a few weeks to pack up 30 years of accumulated life and find suitable housing. Victoria paused for exactly 3 seconds before informing me that they'd be arriving Saturday morning with a moving truck and expected the house to be ready for occupancy. Today was Wednesday. I felt my mouth go dry as I calculated the impossibility of finding, securing, and moving into a new home in 72 hours. When I mentioned this minor logistical nightmare, Victoria's tone shifted from businesslike to barely concealed irritation. She reminded me that the house was legally theirs now, that they had every right to occupy their property, and that my failure to plan ahead wasn't their responsibility. But then, as if struck by sudden inspiration or perhaps temporary kindness, she offered a solution. There was a storage shed behind the house, originally built for beach equipment and lawn furniture, that had been converted into a small guest space years ago, when Richard's brother needed a place to stay during his divorce. It had electricity, running water, even a small kitchenette, and bathroom. I could stay there temporarily while I figured out my next steps. Temporarily, the word hung in the air like smoke from a campfire, stinging my eyes and making it hard to breathe. I was 72 years old, a widow with a decent savings account and good credit, being offered the privilege of living in a shed behind the house I'd just given away. But what choice did I have? Hotels were expensive, and my sister's guest room in San Diego wasn't available until the end of the month due to her own house guests. I agreed to the arrangement, telling myself it would only be for a week or two, just until I could find a proper apartment. Victoria's relief was audible through the phone as she thanked me for being so understanding and flexible. She even offered to help me move my essential belongings to the shed, though her tone suggested this was a favor she hoped I wouldn't accept. Friday night, I packed 2 suitcases with clothes, toiletries and a few precious items, Richard's wedding ring, our photo albums, and a small jewelry box that had belonged to my mother. Everything else would have to wait until I could arrange proper storage or decide what to do with a lifetime's worth of accumulated possession. I sat in our bedroom one last time, looking out at the ocean through windows I'd cleaned countless times, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and pink that no photograph could ever capture. The shed wasn't terrible, I told myself as I surveyed my new temporary quarters Saturday evening. It was maybe 400 square feet total, with a Murphy bed that folded down from the wall, a tiny kitchenette with a mini fridge and 2-burner stove, and a bathroom so small I had to step into the shower to close the door. The previous tenant had left behind some basic furniture, a small table, 2 chairs, a bookshelf and a television that received exactly 3 channels with decent clarity, but it was clean, functional, and private. Most importantly, it was temporary. I could handle anything if it was temporary. Marcus and Victoria arrived with their moving truck and an army of professional movers, who treated our family heirlooms like they were loading a warehouse. I watched from the shed's single window as strangers carried out Richard's desk, my grandmother's china cabinet, and the dining room table where we'd hosted Christmas dinner for 3 decades. Victoria directed the operation wearing yoga pants and a tank top, her blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, looking more like a general commanding troops than a daughter-in-law who'd just displaced her husband's mother. Marcus caught my eye once through the window and waved, but he didn't come over to check on me or see if I needed anything. He just loaded another box into the donation truck and continued working like I wasn't watching my entire life being dismantled and redistributed by strangers. The twins, Sophia and Emma, were 8 years old and beautiful in that effortless way children possess before life teaches them to doubt themselves. They had Victoria's blonde hair and Marcus's dark eyes, and they ran around the property like they owned it, which I suppose they now did. They peeked into the shed once, giggling and whispering to each other before Victoria called them away, reminding them not to bother Grandma Peggy while she was settling in. Grandma Peggy. Not Grammy, which is what they'd called me since they could talk. Not even Grandma Margaret, just Grandma Peggy, like I was some distant relative they barely knew, instead of the woman who'd babysat them countless weekends, taught them to build sandcastles, and kept a drawer full of their artwork in my kitchen. That first night in the shed, I made myself a simple dinner of canned soup and crackers, trying to ignore the sounds of laughter and music drifting from the main house. Through the thin walls I could hear Victoria giving the girls a tour of their new rooms, explaining where they'd put their beds and toys and all the wonderful changes they'd make to personalize their space. It was past 10 o'clock when the house finally went quiet, and I lay on the Murphy bed staring at the ceiling, wondering how I'd gone from homeowner to squatter in the span of a week. The next morning, I woke to the sound of a landscaping crew trimming bushes and mowing grass. Victoria had wasted no time hiring professionals to maintain the yard that Richard and I had lovingly tended ourselves for decades. I dressed quickly and stepped outside to survey the work, only to discover that they'd removed the small garden I'd maintained near the back patio, the one where I grew tomatoes and herbs and the lavender that reminded me of my childhood home in England. Victoria emerged from the house carrying a cup of coffee in a mug I recognized as part of the set Richard and I had received as a wedding gift. She saw me standing near the uprooted garden and walked over with a sympathetic expression that didn't quite reach her eye. The landscaper recommended removing all the vegetables, she explained, because they attracted pests and didn't fit the aesthetic she was going for. She was planning to install a Zen garden with decorative stones and drought-resistant plants that would require minimal maintenance, much more appropriate for a beach house. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story, she said, and certainly more appealing to potential buyers if they ever decided to sell. I nodded and forced a smile, swallowing the words that wanted to tumble out about how those tomatoes had fed our family for summer. How Richard proposed to me in that very spot 35 years ago. How I'd spent countless mornings tending those plants while drinking coffee and watching the sunrise. Instead, I asked if she needed any help with the house, if there was anything I could do to make the transition easier. Victoria's smile brightened considerably as she explained that she was hosting a dinner party the following weekend for Marcus's colleagues and their spouses. Nothing too elaborate, just 12 people for a casual evening of good food and conversation. She'd hired a catering company to handle most of the preparation, but she could use help with setup and cleanup, especially since she wasn't familiar with where everything was stored in the house yet. I agreed immediately, grateful for the opportunity to be useful and to spend time in the home that still felt like mine despite what the legal documents said. Victoria seemed pleased by my enthusiasm and promised to provide me with all the details as the event approached. For the first time since the move, I felt like maybe this arrangement could work, like maybe we could coexist peacefully until I found my own place. That optimism lasted exactly 6 days. The dinner party was scheduled for Saturday evening, and Victoria had transformed the main living area into something that looked more like a magazine photo shoot than a family home. Gone were the comfortable lived-in touches that had made the space warm and welcoming. Richard's collection of maritime books, my grandmother's doilies, the family photos that had covered every available surf. In their place were carefully curated decorative objects, minimalist artwork and flowers arranged with mathematical precision. I arrived at 4 o'clock as requested, wearing my best dress and carrying a notepad to jot down instructions. Victoria greeted me at the door wearing a black cocktail dress that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check, her hair professionally styled and her makeup flawless. She looked like she belonged in the pages of Architectural Digest, not standing in the kitchen where I'd made countless family meals. The catering staff had already arrived and were bustling around with military efficiency, transforming my familiar kitchen into a professional workspace filled with unfamiliar equipment and exotic ingredients. Victoria handed me a clipboard with a detailed timeline and explained that my primary responsibilities would be greeting guests, taking coats, refilling drinks, and general hostess assistance. I felt a small flutter of unease as I realized she expected me to serve her guests rather than join them as a family member, but I pushed the feeling aside. She was nervous about her first major social event in the new house, and it made sense that she'd want everything to run smoothly. I could swallow my pride for one evening if it helped establish a peaceful coexistence. The guests began arriving at 6:30, and I positioned myself near the front door as instructed, ready to welcome them with a smile and direct them to the living area where Victoria and Marcus were holding court. The first couple through the door were the Hendersons, colleagues of Marcus from his law firm, and they handed me their coats with the automatic courtesy people extend to service staff. Mrs. Henderson complimented the house's stunning ocean views and asked if I was the housekeeper. Before I could respond, Victoria appeared beside me with a glass of wine and a brilliant smile, introducing me as Marcus's mother who was helping out this evening. The way she said it made it sound like a temporary favor rather than a family member pitching in, but Mrs. Henderson nodded politely and moved toward the living room without further question. Over the next hour I greeted 8 more couples, hung coats in the closet that used to store my winter jackets, and fetched drinks from the kitchen where caterers were plating appetizers on china I'd eaten from for 30 years. Victoria floated through the party like a practiced socialite, charming her guests with stories about their exciting move to the beach and their plans for renovating the house to better suit their family's needs. I heard her describe the property as a diamond in the rough that needed significant updates to bring it into the 21st century. She mentioned plans to knock out walls, update the kitchen with modern appliances, and convert the master bedroom into a suite with a spa-like bathroom and walk-in closet. Her guests nodded appreciatively and offered suggestions about contractors and designers, treating the house like a project to be conquered rather than a home to be cherished. During dinner, I helped the catering staff serve courses and refill wine glasses, moving quietly around the table while the guests discussed vacation plans, private schools, and real estate investment. Marcus sat at the head of the table where Richard used to sit, looking comfortable and confident as he shared anecdotes about his legal cases and laughed at his colleagues' jokes. He didn't make eye contact with me once during the entire meal. It was nearly 10 o'clock when the last guest finally left, and I began helping the catering staff clean up while Victoria and Marcus retreated to the living room with a final glass of wine. I loaded dishes into the dishwasher I'd loaded thousands of times before, wiped down counters I'd wiped down every day for decades, and swept floors I'd swept so often I could do it in my sleep. The head caterer, a kind woman named Rosa who looked about my age, watched me work for a few minutes before gently suggesting that I should go rest while they finished the cleanup. When I protested that I didn't mind helping, she glanced toward the living room where Victoria's laughter echoed off the walls and quietly told me that the family had already paid for full service, including clean. I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment as I realized how the evening must have looked to the catering staff, an elderly woman being treated like hired help in what was obviously once her own home. Rosa's kindness made it worse somehow, the gentle pity in her eyes as she handed me a plate of leftover appetizers and suggested I take some food back to my quarters. My quarter, not my room, not even the guest house, but quarters, like I was live-in staff being provided with basic accommodations in exchange for services rendered. I thanked Rosa, gathered the leftovers, and slipped out the back door without saying goodnight to Victoria and Marcus, who were still dissecting the evening's social dynamics and planning their next entertaining venture. Back in the shed, I sat at the small table eating catered appetizers and staring out the window at the house where lights blazed in every room. I could see Victoria and Marcus moving around the living room, probably discussing which guests they wanted to invite back, and which ones hadn't quite met their social standards. They looked happy, successful, perfectly matched in their ambitions and aesthetic, and I felt invisible, like a ghost haunting the edges of their new life, tolerated but not welcomed, useful but not valued. For the first time since Richard's death, I cried not from grief but from humiliation, from the crushing realization that I'd given away not just my home but my dignity, my place in my own family's story. That night, as I lay on the Murphy bed listening to the ocean waves that had once lulled me to sleep in my own bedroom, I made a decision. I would start looking for my own place immediately, not just casually browsing listings, but actively searching with the urgency of someone who needed to escape before she disappeared entirely. I had no idea that things were about to get much worse before they got better, or that the phone call that would change everything was still 3 weeks away. I just knew that I couldn't continue living like a tolerated stranger in the shadow of my former life, serving wine to people who didn't know my name, and cleaning up after parties in rooms where I'd once been the hostess. I was Margaret Peggy Williams, not a housekeeper, or a burden, or a temporary inconvenience. I was a widow, a mother, a grandmother, and a woman who'd spent 72 years building a life that mattered. And I wasn't going to let anyone, not even my own son and his wife, make me forget that fundamental truth about who I was and what I deserved. The phone in the shed had exactly 2 numbers programmed into it, Marcus's cell phone and the main house landline. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I wondered if there would ever come a time when I'd need to use either one, or if I'd simply fade away quietly like morning fog over the ocean, forgotten by morning and mourned by no one. The morning after the dinner party, I woke to the sound of construction equipment rumbling to life in what used to be my front yard. Through the shed's small window, I watched a crew of workers unloading tile samples and paint cans from a van while Victoria stood nearby consulting a tablet and gesturing toward various parts of the house. She was dressed in designer jeans and a cashmere sweater despite the early hour, looking more like she was supervising a photo shoot than a renovation. I wrapped my robe around myself and stepped outside to see what was happening, still groggy from a restless night spent replaying the humiliation of being mistaken for hired help in my own former home. The foreman, a burly man with calloused hands and kind eyes, noticed me emerging from the shed and tipped his baseball cap politely, "Morning, ma'am," he said with a slight accent I couldn't quite place. "We'll try to keep the noise down, but we've got some pretty extensive work scheduled over the next few weeks." Victoria looked up from her tablet at the sound of his voice and walked over with a smile that seemed more genuine than any expression I'd seen from her lately. She explained that they were starting with the kitchen renovation, completely gutting the existing layout to create an open concept design that would flow better into the living area. The old cabinets were being replaced with custom millwork, the countertops upgraded to imported quartz, and the appliances swapped out for commercial-grade stainless steel models that would make entertaining much easier. I listened to her describe the demolition of the kitchen, where I'd made breakfast for Richard every morning for 30 years, where I'd taught Marcus to scramble eggs when he was 12, where the twins had helped me bake Christmas cookies just last December. She spoke with the enthusiasm of someone discussing exciting new project rather than erasing decades of family memories embedded in every cabinet and countertop. The work would take approximately 6 weeks to complete, Victoria continued, and during that time the main house would be largely uninhabitable. She and Marcus had arranged to stay at her parents' vacation home in Santa Barbara, and the twins would spend most of their time at summer camps and with friends. "The timing was perfect," she said, "because it would allow the contractors to work without disruption and give them a chance to really transform the space." I asked where that left me, gesturing toward the shed that barely qualified as temporary housing under the best of circumstances. Victoria's smile faltered slightly as she glanced at the construction crew, who were pretending not to listen while clearly hanging on every word of our conversation. She suggested that this might be the perfect opportunity for me to find more permanent accommodations, perhaps something closer to my sister in San Diego, or maybe one of those lovely senior communities with activities and healthcare services on site. The shed would be difficult to access during construction anyway, with workers needing to use the space for equipment storage and as a staging area for materials. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet as I realized that Victoria wasn't just renovating the house, she was renovating her life to exclude me entirely. The shed had been a temporary solution, but now even that meager accommodation was being reclaimed for more practical purposes. I was being evicted from my own property by someone who'd owned it for exactly 1 week. But something in the foreman's expression caught my attention. A subtle frown as he listened to Victoria explain why the elderly woman living in the shed would need to find somewhere else to go. He cleared his throat politely and mentioned that his crew was very experienced at working around occupied dwellings, that they'd completed dozens of renovations without displacing residents, especially elderly family members who might have difficulty relocating on short notice. Victoria's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as she explained that the situation was more complicated than it appeared, that I had always planned to move out soon anyway, and that the renovation simply provided a convenient deadline for everyone involved. The foreman nodded slowly but continued to look uncomfortable, and I realized that my situation was more transparent to strangers than I'd thought. After Victoria returned to her consultations with the design team, I approached the foreman and introduced myself properly. His name was Carlos Mendoza, and he'd been running construction crews in the area for 25 years. He'd seen plenty of family dynamics play out during renovation projects, and his expression suggested he recognized the pattern of what was happening here. Carlos asked if I had somewhere else to stay during the construction, and when I admitted that I was still looking for options, he offered to work around my schedule as much as possible. His crew could focus on the front of the house first, leaving the back area near the shed accessible for several more weeks. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it would buy me time to figure out my next steps without being forced into a hasty decision. Over the next few days, as demolition began in earnest, and the sound of sledgehammers became the soundtrack to my mornings, I threw myself into apartment hunting with the desperation of someone who'd finally accepted that temporary had become permanent. I spent hours online scrolling through rental listings, most of which were either too expensive or too far from anything familiar. The few places I could afford were either in neighborhoods that made me nervous or had waitlists longer than my remaining life expectancy. Senior communities required extensive applications and financial documentation, plus most had monthly fees that would devour my savings faster than I could replenish them. Regular apartments wanted first and last month's rent, plus security deposits that assumed I was planning to throw parties and punch holes in walls. I called my sister Patricia in San Diego to explore the possibility of staying with her until I found something permanent, but she was dealing with her own housing crisis. Her husband had recently been diagnosed with early-stage dementia, and they were in the process of retrofitting their home with safety features and hiring home healthcare aides. Adding another person to their household, even temporarily, would strain both their resources and their marriage. Patricia felt terrible about not being able to help, and I could hear the guilt in her voice as she explained their situation. She offered to loan me money for deposits or help me research assisted living facilities, but we both knew that financial assistance wouldn't solve the underlying problem. I was 72 years old, newly widowed, and essentially homeless, because of my own generosity. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd given away $1 million property and was now struggling to find basic housing I could afford. Richard had always handled our finances, and while I wasn't poor by any stretch of the imagination, I wasn't wealthy enough to maintain the lifestyle I'd enjoyed as a married homeowner. My Social Security covered basic needs, and Richard's life insurance had provided a decent nest egg, but it wouldn't last forever if I had to pay market-rate rent in Southern California. Marcus called me exactly once during that first week of construction, and only because Victoria had prompted him to check on my housing search. His voice was strained and distracted as he asked if I'd found anything suitable, if I needed help with applications or deposits, if there was anything he could do to make the transition easier. I told him about the challenges I was facing, the limited options within my budget, the waiting lists and application requirements that seemed designed to discourage people like me. He listened with the patience of someone fulfilling an obligation rather than genuine concern, offering generic suggestions about expanding my search radius or considering different types of housing arrangement. When I mentioned that some of the nicest senior communities had waiting lists of 6 months or more, Marcus suggested that maybe I should have started looking earlier, before signing over the house. The comment stung because it was both accurate and completely unhelpful, like pointing out that someone should have brought an umbrella while they're already soaked in the rain. Our conversation lasted exactly 12 minutes, and he ended it by promising to ask Victoria if she knew of any resources or connections that might help speed up my search. I thanked him and hung up, knowing that Victoria's idea of helping would probably involve researching facilities in other states where the cost of living was lower, and I'd be conveniently out of sight. That evening, as I sat in the shed listening to the sound of debris being loaded into dumpsters and imagining 30 years of memories being carted away as construction waste, Carlos knocked on my door. He was holding a thermos of coffee and wearing the tired expression of someone who'd been wrestling with his conscience. He asked if he could sit down for a minute, and I invited him to the small table where I'd been spreading out apartment listings like tarot cards that might reveal my future. Carlos poured coffee for both of us and sat quietly for a moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. He told me that he'd been in construction long enough to recognize when someone was being pushed out of their own family when renovation became a convenient excuse for rearranging relationships along with furniture. He'd seen adult children use home improvements as opportunities to establish new boundaries with aging parents, sometimes out of necessity but often out of convenience. What bothered him, Carlos said, was the way Victoria had discussed my situation with the design team, referring to me as a temporary complication that would be resolved once the renovation was complete. She'd asked about soundproofing options for the master suite and whether the new kitchen layout would provide enough privacy for entertaining without disturbance from other parts of the property. The implications were clear. Victoria was planning a future that didn't include me anywhere on the premises, not even in the shed that had become my reluctant refuge. The renovation wasn't just about updating the house. It was about erasing any trace of the family that had lived there before, starting with the inconvenient mother-in-law who represented an unwelcome connection to the past. Carlos offered to slow down the construction timeline if it would help me find better housing options, but we both knew that delaying the inevitable wouldn't solve the fundamental problem. I thanked him for his kindness and honesty, and we sat drinking coffee while the sun set over the ocean that had been my view for 3 decades. But now felt like something I was watching through someone else's window. After Carlos left, I called Patricia back and asked if she knew anything about tenant rights for people in my situation. As a retired paralegal, she'd dealt with housing issues before, and she promised to research whether there were any protections for family members who'd been given informal housing arrangements. What she discovered wasn't encouraging. Without a formal lease or rental agreement, I had virtually no legal standing to remain on the property, even in the shed. The fact that I'd transferred ownership to Marcus and Victoria meant they had every right to determine who lived on their land and under what conditions. My only recourse would be to prove elder abuse or financial exploitation, which would require evidence of coercion or fraud in the property transfer. Since I'd voluntarily signed over the deed in front of witnesses and a notary, demonstrating coercion would be nearly impossible. Victoria had been careful never to explicitly demand that I leave, instead framing everything as helpful suggestions and convenient timing. She'd created a situation where I was being forced out through circumstances rather than direct action, making it difficult to prove intentional displacement. Patricia suggested that I might have more leverage than I realized, though. The house had been in our family for 30 years, and I'd invested significant time and money in maintaining and improving the property. More importantly, there might be tax implications to the property transfer that Marcus and Victoria hadn't fully considered, especially if they decided to sell the house within a certain time frame. She offered to make some calls to lawyer friends who specialized in real estate and elder law, not because she thought I had grounds for a lawsuit, but because information was power, and I might have more options than Victoria wanted me to believe. Sometimes people were more willing to negotiate when they realized that their actions had consequences they hadn't anticipated. Meanwhile, the renovation continued with ruthless efficiency. The kitchen I'd organized and reorganized countless times was reduced to bare studs and exposed plumbing in a matter of days. The breakfast nook where Marcus had done homework while I cooked dinner was opened up into a larger space that would accommodate a dining table for 12. The pantry where I'd stored ingredients for 30 years of family meals was eliminated entirely to make room for a wine refrigerator and coffee station. I watched it all from the shed window, feeling like I was witnessing the systematic erasure of my own history. Every demolished wall and replaced fixture was another connection to Richard, to Marcus's childhood, to the life we'd built together being discarded as outdated and inconvenient. Victoria supervised it all with the enthusiasm of someone finally able to impose her vision on a space that had never quite felt like home. The twins visited twice during that first week, brought by Marcus for brief tours of the construction progress and to collect belongings they'd left behind. Both times they waved at me through the shed window but didn't come over to visit. Victoria kept them busy with explanations of the renovation plans and discussions of how their new bedrooms would be decorated once the work was complete. I overheard Sophia ask where Grandma Peggy was going to sleep once the construction was finished, and Victoria's response was carefully vague. She said that Grandma was looking for her own special place to live, somewhere that would be perfect for someone her age, with people to take care of her and activities to keep her busy. She made it sound like assisted living was a prize I'd won rather than exile. I was being forced to accept. Emma, who'd always been the more perceptive of the twins, asked why I couldn't just keep living in the shed, and Victoria explained that the space was needed for other purposes, that it wasn't really suitable for permanent residence anyway. She promised that once I found my new home, they'd be able to visit me there and maybe even have sleepovers. Though her tone suggested this was about as likely as a visit to the moon. That night, I called Marcus directly instead of waiting for him to check in with his weekly obligation call. I told him I needed to discuss the timeline for my move and whether there were any alternatives we hadn't considered. His response was immediate and defensive, as if he'd been expecting this conversation and dreading it in equal measure. He reminded me that the shed had always been intended as temporary housing, that everyone understood I'd be moving out once I found suitable accommodation. The renovation had simply provided a deadline that would be helpful for everyone involved, giving me motivation to finalize my housing search instead of postponing the inevitable. When I pointed out that suitable accommodations were harder to find than anyone had anticipated, especially on the timeline Victoria had imposed, Marcus's voice took on the strained patience of someone explaining obvious facts to a difficult child. He suggested that perhaps I'd been too particular about location and amenities, that there were plenty of housing options if I was willing to be more flexible about my requirement. I asked him directly if he wanted me to leave, if having me on the property was causing problems for his marriage or his family. The question hung in the air for a long moment before he answered with a sigh that told me everything I needed to know. He said it wasn't about wanting me gone, It was about everyone needing space to build their own lives without feeling obligated to manage situations that had become complicated. Victoria was trying to establish their family's routine in the new house, and my presence made that more difficult because she felt responsible for my well-being while also trying to focus on her own family's needs. The words were carefully chosen to sound reasonable and considerate, but their meaning was unmistakable. I was a burden that everyone would be happier without, a complication that needed to be resolved so that real life could begin. Marcus might feel guilty about displacing me, but not guilty enough to take a stand against his wife's obvious preference for my absence. I told him I understood, and that I'd redouble my efforts to find somewhere else to live as quickly as possible. He thanked me for being so understanding and promised to help with moving expenses or anything else I might need to facilitate the transition. The conversation ended with both of us pretending that this was a mutual decision rather than an eviction wrapped in family politeness. After hanging up, I sat in the dark shed listening to the ocean waves and feeling more alone than I had since Richard's death. At least grief had been honest, a straightforward emotion that matched the reality of loss. This was different, more complex and shameful because it involved the deliberate cruelty of people who were supposed to love me, who were choosing convenience over compassion and covering it with concern for my own well-being. I made a decision that night as I lay on the Murphy bed listening to the sound of my old life being demolished outside my window. I would find a place to live, but I wouldn't just disappear quietly into whatever senior housing facility would accept me. If Marcus and Victoria wanted me gone, they'd have to own that decision completely, without the comfortable fiction that they were helping me transition to a better situation. But first I needed to understand exactly what I'd given up when I signed over that deed, and whether there were any cards left in my hand that I hadn't thought to play. Patricia's lawyer friends might have information that could change the dynamics of this whole situation, and I was finally angry enough to find out what those options might be. I was done being the grateful mother who accepted whatever crumbs of consideration her family offered. It was time to remember that I was Margaret Williams, not just Marcus's inconvenient mother or Victoria's temporary problem, and that I'd survived 72 years by being stronger and smarter than people assumed. The renovation could continue, the kitchen could be gutted, and Victoria could plan her perfect future all she wanted. But I wasn't going to make it easy for anyone to pretend that pushing me out was really for my own good, and I certainly wasn't going to help them feel better about choosing their comfort over my dignity. The real fight was about to begin, and they had no idea what they'd awakened by trying to make me disappear. Patricia's lawyer friend turned out to be a sharp-eyed woman named Elena Rodriguez who specialized in elder law and had seen enough family property disputes to recognize the warning signs immediately. When I called her office and explained my situation, she agreed to meet with me that afternoon at a coffee shop in Santa Monica, away from the construction noise and prying eyes that had become constant features of my daily life. Elena was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she didn't waste time on pleasantries when serious issues were at stake. She listened to my story without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad, and occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates, witnesses, and specific conversation. When I finished explaining how I'd gone from homeowner to shed dweller in the span of 2 weeks, Elena set down her pen and studied me with an expression that was equal parts sympathy and strategic calculation. She asked if I'd brought copies of the property transfer documents, and I handed over the folder I'd been carrying like a shield since Patricia first suggested I needed legal advice. Elena reviewed the paperwork with the methodical attention of someone who understood that details mattered, occasionally making notes in the margins or highlighting specific clauses. After 20 minutes of careful examination, she looked up with a slight smile that suggested she'd found something interesting. The first thing she pointed out was that the property transfer had been structured as a gift rather than a sale, which had significant tax implications that neither Marcus nor Victoria had apparently considered. Under current federal law, any property gift exceeding a certain threshold required the filing of specific tax forms and potentially triggered gift tax obligations that could amount to hundreds of thousands of dollars. More importantly, Elena explained, there were questions about whether the transfer constituted a legitimate gift or whether it was part of a larger pattern of financial exploitation. The fact that I'd been displaced from the property immediately after signing it over, combined with the informal housing arrangement that was now being terminated, suggested that the gift might not have been as voluntary as it appeared on paper. Elena asked detailed questions about my financial situation, my relationship with Marcus and Victoria before Richard's death, and whether anyone had pressured me to make the property transfer. When I described Victoria's eagerness to accept the gift and her immediate plans to move in, Elena's expression grew more serious. She explained that elder financial abuse often looked exactly like what I was describing: family members who encouraged elderly relatives to transfer assets under the guise of estate planning or family generosity, then systematically excluded those relatives from enjoying the benefits of their own former property. The fact that I was now being forced to find alternative housing while Marcus and Victoria enjoyed the $1 million home I'd given them raised red flags about their true motivation. But Elena was careful to explain that proving financial exploitation would be difficult and potentially expensive, especially since I'd signed the transfer documents voluntarily and in front of witnesses. The legal system was reluctant to overturn property transfers unless there was clear evidence of fraud, coercion, or diminished mental capacity at the time of signing. However, she continued, that didn't mean I was without options. California law included specific protections for elderly family members who found themselves in situations like mine, and there were several strategies we could pursue that might encourage Marcus and Victoria to reconsider their approach to my housing situation. The most immediate option was to file a formal complaint with the county's Adult Protective Services Division, alleging that I was being subjected to housing discrimination and potential financial abuse by family members. Even if the investigation didn't result in criminal charges, it would create an official record of the situation and might motivate Marcus and Victoria to find a more reasonable solution. Elena also suggested that we could explore whether the property transfer had been properly reported for tax purposes, and if not, whether Marcus and Victoria were prepared to deal with the financial consequences of their oversight. The IRS took gift tax violations seriously, especially when substantial amounts of money were involved, and the penalties could be severe enough to make keeping the house financially impractical. But the most intriguing option Elena presented was something I hadn't considered: the possibility that I retained certain legal rights to the property even after transferring ownership. California recognized a legal concept called life estate, which allowed property owners to transfer title while retaining the right to live on the property for the remainder of their lives. While my transfer documents hadn't explicitly created a life estate, Elena explained that the circumstances surrounding the gift, combined with my immediate displacement and ongoing housing crisis, might provide grounds for arguing that such an arrangement had been implied. If a court agreed that I had reasonable expectations of continued residence based on family discussions and the timing of the transfer, it might order Marcus and Victoria to provide suitable on-site housing or compensate me for the value of that housing right. The conversation left my head spinning with possibilities I hadn't known existed, but Elena cautioned me that pursuing any of these options would likely damage my relationship with Marcus permanently and create ongoing conflict that might not be worth the potential benefit. She recommended that I consider whether there were ways to resolve the situation through family negotiation before escalating to legal action. I thanked Elena for her time and promised to consider my options carefully before making any decision. She gave me her business card and suggested that I document everything going forward: conversations with Marcus and Victoria, interactions with the construction crew, and any statements about my housing situation or future plans. If I decided to pursue legal remedies, contemporary records would be crucial for establishing my case. Driving back to the shed that evening, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this whole situation began: a sense of agency. For weeks I'd felt like a passive victim of circumstances beyond my control, grateful for whatever scraps of consideration my family offered, and apologetic for being an inconvenience. Now I understood that I had choices, even if none of them were particularly appealing. That night I started a journal documenting every interaction with Marcus and Victoria, every conversation about my housing situation, and every detail about how I was being treated as a displaced person on my former property. If Elena's legal strategies required evidence, I would make sure to provide it in abundance. The next morning brought a new humiliation that crystallized my resolve to stop accepting unacceptable treatment. Victoria had scheduled a photography session to document the renovation progress for her social media accounts, and she asked me to stay inside the shed during the shoot, because my presence might be confusing for followers who didn't understand our family situation. I watched from behind curtains as a professional photographer captured images of Victoria posing in hard hat and safety glasses, looking like a glamorous contractor overseeing her dream renovation. She directed shots of the demolished kitchen, the new design plans, and herself selecting tile samples with the focused intensity of someone making important creative decisions. The photographer asked about the shed, wondering if it should be included in the renovation story, and Victoria explained that it was temporary storage space that would eventually be converted into a yoga studio or meditation retreat once the main house was completed. She described her vision for the entire property with the confidence of someone who'd owned it for decades rather than weeks. That afternoon, Victoria's social media posts began appearing with captions about transforming our dream beach house and bringing new life to a dated property that needed serious update. The comments from her friends were full of congratulations and excitement about her renovation journey, with several people asking for design tips and contractor recommendations. I realized that in Victoria's version of events, I had never existed. The house had no previous family history worth acknowledging, no decades of memories worth preserving, no elderly woman who'd given up everything to provide this opportunity for the next generation. I was simply being edited out of the story as thoroughly as the old kitchen cabinet. That evening, I called Marcus and asked if we could meet for coffee to discuss my housing search and timeline. I suggested a neutral location away from the construction noise, and he agreed to meet me the next morning at a diner in town that we'd visited together when he was younger and came to stay with us during summer vacation. The diner hadn't changed much over the years, still featuring red vinyl booths and waitresses who'd been working the morning shift since the Clinton administration. Marcus arrived looking tired and slightly guilty, wearing the expression of someone who'd been dreading this conversation but knew it was inevitable. He ordered coffee and asked about my apartment search, and I told him honestly about the challenges I'd encountered, the limited options within my budget, the waiting lists at decent facilities, and the difficulty of finding housing that would allow me to maintain any connection to the community where I'd lived for 30 years. Marcus listened with what seemed like genuine concern, occasionally asking follow-up questions about specific properties or requirements. For a moment it felt like talking to the son I remembered, the one who used to care about my opinions and feelings before marriage and career success had shifted his priorities toward maintaining domestic harmony at any cost. When I finished describing my housing situation, I told Marcus about my meeting with Elena Rodriguez and the legal options she'd outlined. I watched his expression change from concern to alarm as I explained the potential tax implications of the property transfer and the possibility that my displacement could be considered elder abuse under California law. Marcus immediately became defensive, insisting that no one had forced me to transfer the property and that the housing arrangement was always intended to be temporary. He reminded me that they'd offered to help with moving expenses and finding suitable accommodations, and that any delays in my relocation were due to my own reluctance to accept reasonable alternatives. I asked him directly whether he believed that sleeping in a shed behind the house I'd owned for 30 years while being excluded from family gatherings and treated like hired help constituted reasonable treatment for a mother who'd just given her children $1 million gift. The question hung in the air between us like smoke from a grease fire, acrid and impossible to ignore. Marcus struggled to formulate a response that would justify the unjustifiable, finally settling on the argument that Victoria was under tremendous stress from the move and renovation, that my presence on the property made it difficult for her to feel comfortable in what was supposed to be her new home. He suggested that finding separate housing would be better for everyone's mental health and family relationships. I pointed out that Victoria seemed comfortable enough to host dinner parties and photography sessions, while I hid in the shed like an embarrassing secret, and that her stress level might be related more to managing her image than to my actual presence. Marcus's jaw tightened at this observation, and I realized I'd touched on something he didn't want to acknowledge even to himself. The conversation deteriorated from there, with Marcus becoming increasingly defensive about his wife's behavior and my responses becoming more pointed about the reality of how I was being treated. We ended up talking past each other rather than to each other, both of us entrenched in positions that made compromise impossible. Marcus finally stood up and threw money on the table for coffee neither of us had finished, telling me that he hoped I'd reconsider pursuing legal action that would only hurt the family and cost everyone time and money they didn't have. He said that Victoria was trying her best to balance competing demands, and that I was making an already difficult situation worse by looking for reasons to feel victimized. I stayed in the booth for a long time after he left, staring out the window at the Pacific Coast Highway and thinking about how we'd arrived at this point where a conversation between mother and son could end with accusations and ultimatums instead of understanding and solution. The Marcus who'd just walked out was someone I barely recognized, someone who'd learned to prioritize avoiding conflict over addressing problems. But his reaction had also confirmed something important. He and Victoria were more vulnerable than they wanted to admit, and the legal options Elena had outlined were serious enough to threaten their carefully constructed narrative about generous family arrangements and temporary housing solutions. When I returned to the shed that afternoon, I found Carlos waiting for me with an expression that suggested he had news I needed to hear. He'd been talking to some of the other contractors working on the property, and they'd mentioned overhearing Victoria on the phone with someone about permits and zoning regulations for the shed conversion she'd mentioned to the photographer. According to what Carlos had pieced together from various conversations, Victoria was planning to convert the shed into rental income property once I moved out, possibly as an Airbnb or short-term vacation rental that would help offset the renovation cost. The timing of my displacement wasn't coincidental, it was part of a larger financial strategy that required my absence to be profitable. Carlos also mentioned that some of the renovation choices Victoria was making seemed designed more for resale value than family living, including expensive finishes and layouts that prioritized entertaining spaces over practical family needs. Combined with her social media documentation of the renovation process, it suggested that she might be planning to flip the property for profit rather than establish a long-term family home. This information added a new dimension to my situation that I hadn't considered. I might not just be an inconvenient family member being pushed aside, but an obstacle to a profitable real estate venture that depended on my complete removal from the property. The urgency of Victoria's timeline made more sense if she was working towards specific financial goals rather than simply trying to establish family routines. That evening, I called Elena Rodriguez and scheduled another meeting to discuss these new developments. If Marcus and Victoria were planning to profit from the property I'd given them while simultaneously displacing me from any benefit of that gift, it might strengthen the case for financial exploitation that Elena had outlined. I also started researching property records and renovation permits online, trying to understand what Victoria's actual plans might be and whether they matched what she'd told the family about their intentions for the house. If I was going to fight for my rights, I needed to understand exactly what I was fighting against. The shed felt smaller that night as I sat planning my next moves, but for the first time since this ordeal began, I didn't feel powerless. I had information, legal options, and most importantly, I had finally stopped believing that being a burden was something I deserved rather than something being unfairly imposed on me. Victoria might have edited me out of her social media story, but she was about to discover that real life was more complicated than carefully curated Instagram posts. I was Margaret Williams, and I wasn't disappearing quietly just because it would be more convenient for everyone else. The phone call that would change everything was still days away, but the groundwork was being laid with every conversation I documented, every legal option I explored, and every moment I refused to accept that being grateful meant being invisible. Marcus and Victoria had underestimated the woman they were trying to erase, and they were about to learn that kindness and weakness were not the same thing, especially when the stakes involved dignity, family, and the difference between being cared for and being discarded. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source on a Tuesday morning when I was sorting through Richard's old filing cabinet, looking for documents Elena had requested for my case. Hidden behind a folder of ancient tax returns, I found a manila envelope marked Beach House Original Documents in Richard's careful handwriting. Inside were papers I'd never seen before, the original purchase agreement from 1994, surveys, inspection reports, and most importantly a copy of our will that predated the version our lawyer had on file. This earlier will contained a provision I'd completely forgotten about, one that Richard had insisted on including despite my protests at the time. The clause stated that in the event of Richard's death, I would retain lifetime residential rights to the beach house property regardless of any future ownership transfers, ensuring that I could never be displaced from the home we'd built together. Richard had been worried about my financial security if anything happened to him, and he'd wanted legal protection against exactly the situation I now found myself in. The will had been updated several years later to reflect changes in our financial situation, but this particular clause had been carried forward into every subsequent version. When I called our family lawyer, he confirmed that the lifetime residential rights provision was still valid and legally binding, regardless of whether I'd voluntarily transferred ownership to Marcus. I felt my hands shake as I realized what this meant. Victoria's plan to evict me from the shed and convert it to rental income was not only morally questionable, it was potentially illegal. I had documented legal rights to remain on the property for the rest of my life, rights that no property transfer could eliminate without my explicit written consent. Elena Rodriguez was practically vibrating with excitement when I brought her the documents that afternoon. She explained that lifetime residential rights were extremely difficult to overturn, especially when they were established in a valid will, and had been consistently maintained through multiple legal updates. Marcus and Victoria's lawyers should have caught this during the property transfer process, and their failure to address it left them in a precarious legal position. More importantly, Elena continued, the fact that they had actively tried to force me off the property despite my legal rights could be considered intentional interference with my residential interests, which carried both civil and potentially criminal penalties under California law. If they had known about the lifetime rights provision and proceeded anyway, it could constitute deliberate elder abuse. Elena suggested that we needed to determine whether Marcus and Victoria were aware of the residential rights clause, and if so, whether they had legal advice about how to address it. She recommended that I contact them directly with a formal notice of my lifetime residential rights, giving them an opportunity to rectify the situation before we pursued more aggressive legal remedies. But first she wanted to gather more evidence about their true intentions for the property. If Victoria was indeed planning to use the shed for rental income while knowing that I had legal rights to occupy it, that would strengthen our case considerably. Elena suggested that I document any conversations or communications about the shed conversion plans, and try to get Victoria to put her intentions in writing. I returned to the beach house that evening with a new sense of purpose and a plan for gathering the evidence Elena needed. The construction crew was wrapping up work for the day, and Victoria was standing in what used to be my kitchen, consulting with an interior designer about cabinet hardware and countertop edges. I approached them with the friendly demeanor of someone making casual conversation rather than conducting reconnaissance, asking about the renovation timeline and expressing interest in how the new layout would function. Victoria seemed pleased by my apparent acceptance of the changes and began describing her vision for the space in detail. The designer, a stylish woman named Miranda who specialized in high-end coastal properties, mentioned that she was also working on plans for the shed conversion project. When I expressed surprise that they were renovating the shed too, Victoria quickly explained that they were considering multiple options for the space, including potential guest accommodations or rental income opportunity. Miranda enthusiastically described her concept for transforming the shed into a luxury studio apartment that could command premium rates from vacation rental guests. She'd already calculated that the location and amenities could generate substantial monthly income, especially during peak summer months when beachfront accommodations were in high demand. Victoria seemed uncomfortable with Miranda's detailed financial projections being discussed in front of me, but I continued asking innocent questions about timelines and rental projections, while mentally recording every detail for Elena's case file. By the end of the conversation, I had clear evidence that Victoria was planning to profit from space she knew I was currently occupying, regardless of whether I had found alternative housing. That night, I called Elena and reported what I'd learned. She was particularly interested in Miranda's comments about premium rental rates and financial projections, since they suggested that Victoria's urgency about my departure was motivated by economic opportunity rather than family comfort concerns. Elena advised me to request a formal family meeting to discuss my housing situation and future plans, using the gathering as an opportunity to present the lifetime residential rights documentation and gauge Marcus and Victoria's reaction. If they were genuinely unaware of my legal rights, their response would be very different than if they had been knowingly trying to circumvent them. She also recommended that I invite Patricia to attend the meeting as a witness and family advocate, since having another adult present would ensure that any agreements or admissions were properly documented. Elena wanted a clear record of how Marcus and Victoria responded to learning about my residential rights, especially if they tried to argue that those rights didn't apply to the current situation. I scheduled the meeting for the following Saturday afternoon, suggesting that we gather in the main house to discuss my housing transition and ensure that everyone was comfortable with the arrangements going forward. Marcus seemed reluctant but agreed to the meeting, probably hoping that I was finally ready to announce my departure date. Victoria was less enthusiastic about the formal discussion, but didn't object when Marcus explained that we needed to clarify expectations and timelines for everyone's peace of mind. I could hear her sighing in the background during our phone conversation, clearly viewing this as another tedious obligation she'd have to endure before getting on with her renovation plan. Patricia drove down from San Diego on Saturday morning, bringing with her a briefcase full of legal documents and a grim determination to support whatever course of action I decided to pursue. She'd reviewed the lifetime residential rights provision with her own lawyer friends and confirmed that it was ironclad and enforceable under current California law. We met in the living room where I'd hosted countless family gatherings, though the space now looked like a furniture showroom with its carefully staged designer pieces and complete absence of personal items. Marcus sat stiffly on a cream-colored sofa that probably cost more than most people's cars, while Victoria perched on the edge of a matching chair as if ready to flee at the first sign of conflict. I began by thanking them for their patience with my housing search and explaining that I'd discovered some important information that affected our family arrangement. Patricia handed me the manila envelope containing Richard's original documents, and I spread the papers on the coffee table with the ceremonial gravity of someone presenting evidence in court. The lifetime residential rights provision was highlighted in yellow marker, and I read it aloud slowly and clearly so there could be no misunderstanding about its meaning or implication. Marcus's face went through several color changes as I explained that Richard had insisted on this protection to ensure I would never be displaced from our family home regardless of changing circumstances. Victoria's reaction was immediate and telling. She began arguing that the provision couldn't possibly apply to the current situation because I had voluntarily transferred ownership of the property. She insisted that lifetime residential rights were automatically voided when someone gave away their property, and that I couldn't claim protection from a will while simultaneously benefiting from my own generosity. Elena had prepared me for this argument, explaining that Victoria's interpretation was both legally incorrect and telling about her true motivation. The fact that she immediately tried to find loopholes rather than expressing concern for my well-being suggested that she'd been hoping to avoid exactly this kind of legal complication. Marcus was quieter but clearly troubled by the implications of what I'd presented. He asked several questions about the legal validity of the provision and whether it had been properly maintained through subsequent will updates. When Patricia confirmed that multiple lawyers had reviewed and preserved the clause over the years, Marcus began to look genuinely worried about the potential consequence. I explained that I wasn't trying to create problems for anyone but that I needed to understand my rights and options before making final housing decisions. The discovery of the residential rights provision meant that I wasn't simply a displaced family member hoping for charity, but someone with legitimate legal standing to remain on the property indefinitely. Victoria's composure cracked as she realized that her renovation timeline and rental income plans were suddenly in jeopardy. She began demanding to know why I hadn't mentioned these rights earlier, why I'd allowed them to proceed with construction plans that assumed my departure, and whether I was deliberately trying to sabotage their family's future. The accusations revealed more about Victoria's true feelings than she probably intended, making it clear that she viewed my presence as an obstacle to her financial plans, rather than a family arrangement requiring compassion and flexibility. Patricia took notes throughout Victoria's outburst, documenting every statement that could be used to demonstrate her mercenary attitude toward my housing situation. Marcus tried to mediate by suggesting that there must be reasonable solutions that would respect everyone's needs and rights,
but Victoria cut him off with a sharp reminder that they'd already invested significant money in renovation plans that depended on having full use of the entire property. She'd made commitments to contractors and designers based on assumptions about the shed conversion, and changing those plans would cost thousands of dollars they hadn't budgeted. I listened to Victoria's financial concerns with the detached interest of someone watching a chess player realize they'd moved their queen into danger.
Her focus on money and renovation costs rather than family relationships or my well-being made it abundantly clear that Elena's suspicions about exploitation had been correct. When Victoria finally finished her litany of complaints about how my legal rights interfered with her business plans, I calmly asked whether she had consulted with lawyers about the property transfer and whether anyone had reviewed the existing will provisions before proceeding with the renovation. The silence that followed was answer enough. Neither Marcus nor Victoria had done proper legal due diligence before accepting the property transfer, and they were now facing consequences they'd never anticipated. Their assumption that a generous mother would simply disappear quietly when her presence became inconvenient had left them legally and financially vulnerable. Patricia asked about the timeline for the shed conversion project and the projected rental income Victoria had discussed with her designer. Victoria's attempt to deny having specific plans fell apart when Patricia mentioned that I'd overheard detailed financial projections during the consultation with Miranda. The meeting deteriorated quickly after that, with Victoria accusing me of spying on her private business discussions and demanding to know whether I was planning to sue them for trying to improve their own property. Marcus looked increasingly uncomfortable as his wife revealed the extent of her resentment toward my continued presence and her assumption that legal ownership gave them unlimited power over my living situation. I finally stood up and gathered the documents, explaining that I needed time to consider my options and consult with my lawyer about the best way to proceed. The lifetime residential rights provision gave me choices I hadn't known I had, and I intended to explore all of them before making any decisions about my future. Victoria's parting shot was that I was being selfish and manipulative by using legal technicalities to interfere with their family's plans, and that Richard would be ashamed of how I was treating his son. The comment stung because it was designed to, but it also revealed the depth of her desperation about losing control over the situation she'd orchestrated. Patricia and I drove back to San Diego that evening in relative silence, both of us processing what we'd witnessed and learned. Victoria's mask had slipped completely during the confrontation, revealing someone who viewed family relationships as transactional arrangements that could be modified when they became inconvenient. Marcus's passivity throughout the meeting had been almost as revealing as Victoria's hostility. He clearly understood the legal implications of what I'd presented, but he seemed more concerned about managing his wife's anger than addressing the fundamental injustice of how I'd been treated. That night, I called Elena and reported on the meeting's outcome. She was particularly interested in Victoria's immediate focus on financial implications and her assumptions about voiding residential rights through property transfer. The conversation had provided exactly the kind of evidence Elena needed to demonstrate that my displacement had been intentional and economically motivated. Elena recommended that we send a formal legal notice to Marcus and Victoria documenting my lifetime residential rights and demanding that they cease all efforts to force my departure from the property. The notice would also require them to provide suitable permanent housing accommodations on the premises and to halt any plans for converting my current residence to other uses. We scheduled a follow-up meeting for the next week to draft the legal notice and discuss strategies for enforcing my rights if Marcus and Victoria continued to resist reasonable accommodation. Elena was confident that we had a strong case, especially given Victoria's documented admission about rental income plans and her obvious resentment about my continued presence. As I prepared for bed in the shed that night, listening to the familiar sound of ocean waves that had lulled me to sleep for 30 years, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Richard's death, a sense of control over my own destiny. I was no longer a helpless widow hoping for family charity, but a woman with legal rights and the determination to enforce them. Victoria had made a crucial error by revealing her true motivations and assumptions during our family meeting. Her focus on financial opportunity rather than family obligation had provided exactly the evidence Elena needed to demonstrate that my displacement was part of a deliberate exploitation scheme rather than a reasonable housing arrangement. The phone call that would change everything was finally within reach, and I was ready to make it. But first, I wanted to give Marcus one last opportunity to choose his mother's dignity over his wife's greed, to remember the values Richard had tried to instill in him about family loyalty and moral responsibility. If he chose Victoria's financial interests over basic human decency, then I would use every legal tool at my disposal to remind them both that kindness was not weakness, and that underestimating elderly women was a mistake that carried serious consequences. The phone call came at 6:30 the next morning before the construction crew arrived and while the house was still quiet except for the sound of waves breaking against the shore. It was Elena Rodriguez, and her voice carried an urgency that immediately told me something significant had happened overnight. She explained that she'd been researching property records and permit applications as part of building our case, and she'd discovered something that changed everything we thought we knew about Marcus and Victoria's situation. The renovation permits Victoria had filed with the county included detailed plans for converting the shed into a short-term rental unit, complete with separate utility meters and commercial-grade amenities. But more importantly, Elena had found evidence that Victoria had already been advertising the shed as a vacation rental on multiple booking platforms, with reservations scheduled to begin just 2 weeks after the main house renovation was completed. The listing described a charming beachside studio with private entrance and stunning ocean views, commanding premium rates that would generate substantial monthly income. Elena's voice grew more animated as she explained the legal implications of what she'd discovered. Victoria had been operating under the assumption that she could simply evict me and immediately convert my living space into a profitable business venture. The fact that she'd already taken paying reservations for space she knew I was occupying constituted fraud, and the advance bookings provided concrete evidence of her financial motivations for forcing my departure. But the most damaging discovery was a series of emails Elena had obtained through public records requests related to the permit application. In correspondence with the county planning department, Victoria had described the shed as currently vacant storage space that would be upgraded to provide luxury accommodations for visiting guests. Her deliberate misrepresentation of my residential status to government officials crossed the line from family conflict into potential criminal territory. Elena suggested that we had enough evidence to pursue multiple legal remedies simultaneously: a restraining order preventing my eviction, a civil lawsuit for elder abuse and financial exploitation, and potentially criminal charges for fraud and perjury in the permit application. The combination of documented evidence and Victoria's own admissions during our family meeting had created an overwhelming case in my favor. More immediately, Elena recommended that we file an emergency motion with the family court to establish my residential rights and prevent any further attempts to displace me from the property. The motion would require Marcus and Victoria to appear before a judge within 72 hours to explain their actions and justify their treatment of an elderly family member with documented legal rights to remain on the premises. I listened to Elena's recommendations with a mixture of vindication and sadness, understanding that pursuing legal action would permanently destroy any remaining relationship with my son and but Victoria's fraudulent booking reservations and deliberate misrepresentations to government officials had eliminated any possibility of resolving this situation through family negotiation. Elena asked if I was prepared to move forward with the emergency motion, explaining that once we filed the paperwork there would be no turning back from a public legal battle that would likely be covered by local media and create lasting consequences for everyone involved. I told her I needed 1 hour to make a final decision, and she agreed to wait for my call. I spent that hour walking along the beach where Richard and I had taken countless morning strolls, thinking about the life we'd built together and the values we'd tried to instill in Marcus during his childhood. Richard had always believed that treating people with dignity and respect was more important than personal advantage, and he would have been heartbroken to see his son prioritizing financial gain over his mother's well-being. But I also thought about the twins, Sophia and Emma, and how this legal battle would affect their understanding of family loyalty and moral responsibility. Did I want their memories of their grandmother to be shaped by a bitter court fight? Or was there still a way to teach them that standing up for yourself didn't require destroying other people? The decision crystallized when I returned to the shed and found a note taped to my door. It was from Victoria, written on expensive stationery with her initials embossed at the top, informing me that she needed access to the shed the following week for final measurements and preparation work related to the upcoming renovation. The note's tone was coldly professional, referring to me as the current occupant rather than by name and treating my displacement as a foregone conclusion rather than a matter requiring discussion. Victoria had apparently decided that our family meeting and my presentation of legal documents were merely temporary obstacles to be overcome, rather than legitimate rights to be respected. I called Elena and told her to file every motion and legal action she'd recommend. If Victoria wanted to treat me as a business problem to be solved rather than a family member deserving respect, then I would respond with the full force of legal protections available to elderly citizens being exploited by their own relatives. Elena's emergency motion was filed that afternoon, and by evening Marcus was calling me with panic in his voice and demands for an explanation. He'd been served with legal papers at his office, creating a humiliating scene in front of his colleagues and requiring him to explain why his own mother was taking him to court. I explained calmly that I'd tried to resolve our situation through family discussion, but that Victoria's advance booking reservations and fraudulent permit applications had made legal action necessary to protect my rights. Marcus immediately began defending his wife, insisting that there must be some misunderstanding about the rental bookings and that Victoria would never deliberately mislead government officials. When I mentioned the emails describing the shed as vacant storage space, Marcus went quiet for a long moment before asking where I'd obtained that information. I told him that public records were exactly that, public, and that anyone could access permit applications and related correspondence through standard information requests. Marcus's tone shifted from defensive to pleading as he realized the extent of the legal evidence against him. He asked what it would take to resolve the situation without going to court, suggesting that there might be creative solutions that would satisfy everyone's needs while avoiding public embarrassment and legal expense. I told him that I wanted exactly what Richard's will had guaranteed me: permanent, dignified housing on the family property without interference or time limits, plus an acknowledgement that my displacement had been inappropriate and would not continue. I also wanted Victoria to cancel her fraudulent rental bookings and reimburse any deposits she'd collected for space she had no legal right to rent. Marcus promised to discuss the situation with Victoria and their lawyer, asking if I would agree to postpone the court hearing if they could present a reasonable settlement proposal within 48 hours. I agreed to the delay but warned him that any proposal would need to address the fundamental issue of my residential rights, rather than simply offering temporary compromise. That evening, Victoria appeared at my door for the first time since the family meeting, looking uncharacteristically subdued and carrying a bottle of wine that I recognized as one from Richard's collection. She asked if we could talk privately about our situation and whether there might be ways to resolve our differences without involving lawyers and judges. I invited her in, curious about what approach she would take now that her financial schemes had been exposed and her legal vulnerability established. Victoria sat at my small table, looking around the shed with what might have been genuine remorse, commenting that she hadn't really understood how I'd been living until seeing the space through my eyes. She began by apologizing for the rental bookings, explaining that she'd gotten carried away with renovation excitement and hadn't fully considered the implications of advertising space I was still occupying. The permit applications had been filled out by her designer Miranda, and she hadn't realized that describing the shed as vacant constituted misrepresentation rather than future planning. I listened to Victoria's explanations with the skepticism they deserved, recognizing the careful language of someone trying to minimize legal exposure rather than acknowledge genuine wrongdoing. Her apologies were structured around misunderstandings and miscommunications, rather than deliberate decisions to prioritize profit over family welfare. But then Victoria surprised me by pulling out her phone and showing me screenshots of canceled booking confirmations and refunded deposits. She'd spent the afternoon removing the rental listings and returning money to people who'd reserved the shed for upcoming vacation. The financial loss was substantial, probably several $1,000s in forfeited income, and her willingness to absorb those costs suggested that she was taking the legal threat seriously. Victoria proposed a formal agreement that would guarantee my permanent residence in the shed, while allowing her to proceed with cosmetic improvements that would make the space more comfortable and dignified. She suggested installing better insulation, upgrading the bathroom fixtures,
and adding a small deck that would provide outdoor space and privacy from the main house activity. In exchange, she asked that I agree to reasonable restrictions about noise levels during evening hours and advance notice for any guests I might want to host overnight. The restrictions seemed fair and actually addressed some concerns I'd had about feeling like I was living in my family's backyard rather than having my own independent space. But the most significant part of Victoria's proposal was her offer to formalize our arrangement through a legal document that would be recorded with the county and couldn't be modified without my written consent. She was essentially proposing to create an official granny unit with documented tenant rights that would protect me from future displacement regardless of changing family circumstance. Victoria explained that Marcus had consulted with their lawyer about the residential rights provision in Richard's will, and they'd been advised that fighting my legal standing would be expensive and likely unsuccessful. Rather than spending money on legal fees and court costs, they preferred to invest in creating a living arrangement that would work for everyone long term. I told Victoria that her proposal sounded reasonable in principle, but that I would need Elena to review any legal documents before signing anything. I also wanted guarantees that the shed improvements wouldn't be used as justification for charging me rent or creating other financial obligations that could be used to pressure me in the future. Victoria agreed to all my conditions and asked if I would be willing to call Elena and request a postponement of the court hearing while we worked out the details of a settlement agreement. She seemed genuinely relieved when I agreed to make the call, and for the first time since this entire situation began, I saw traces of the woman Marcus had fallen in love with rather than the calculating opportunist who'd been treating me as an obstacle to her ambition. Elena was cautiously optimistic about Victoria's settlement proposal but insisted on including specific penalties for any future violations of the agreement. She wanted language that would award me substantial financial damages if Marcus and Victoria ever attempted to revoke my housing rights or interfere with my peaceful enjoyment of the property. More importantly, Elena recommended that the settlement include an acknowledgement that my previous treatment had been inappropriate and that future family interactions would be conducted with respect for my dignity and legal status as a permanent resident. She wanted Victoria's behavior documented and corrected through formal agreement rather than simply ignored in the interest of family harmony. The negotiations took 3 days of back-and-forth communications between lawyers, with Elena and Victoria's attorney working through details about improvement specifications, maintenance responsibilities, and enforcement mechanisms. Marcus stayed largely out of the discussions, apparently recognizing that his wife's business relationship with me needed to be established independently of our family relation. The final agreement was more comprehensive than I'd expected, essentially creating a self-contained living unit with private utilities, dedicated parking and landscaping that would provide visual separation from the main house. Victoria had agreed to spend nearly $50,000 on improvements that would transform the shed from basic storage space into comfortable permanent housing. But the most valuable provisions were the legal protections Elena had negotiated. Automatic renewal clauses that prevented termination except for specific violations, inheritance rights that would transfer my residence to Patricia if something happened to me, and penalty clauses that would cost Marcus and Victoria significant money if they ever tried to force my departure. Elena also included a provision requiring Victoria to maintain homeowners insurance that specifically covered my residential rights, ensuring that my housing security couldn't be threatened by insurance claims or policy changes. The agreement was structured to anticipate and prevent every possible future attempt to undermine my position as a permanent family resident. The court hearing was converted to a settlement approval session, where the judge reviewed our agreement and asked specific questions about my understanding of the terms and my voluntary acceptance of the arrangement. Elena had prepared me for this process, explaining that the judge wanted to ensure I wasn't being pressured into accepting inadequate protections in exchange for avoiding legal conflict. Marcus and Victoria sat across the courtroom looking appropriately chastened as the judge read portions of the agreement aloud and commented that families who took care of elderly members through formal legal protections usually avoided the kinds of problems that brought people to his court. His tone suggested that he understood exactly what had happened and approved of the resolution we'd reached. The judge's approval made our settlement legally binding and enforceable through the court system, giving me powerful tools to protect my interests if Marcus and Victoria ever decided that family convenience was more important than legal obligation. I walked out of the courthouse that day feeling more secure than I had since Richard's death, knowing that my housing situation was finally resolved permanently rather than temporarily. The renovation of my living space began immediately, with Victoria managing the project with the same attention to detail she'd applied to the main house improvement. She consulted with me about design choices and color preferences, treating me like a valued client rather than an unwelcome family obligation she was stuck accommodating. Carlos Mendoza supervised the shed renovation with obvious satisfaction, commenting that he'd seen too many elderly family members pushed aside during property improvement. He took special care with details like grab bars in the bathroom and ramp access for the entrance, additions that Victoria had agreed to include even though they weren't specifically required by our settlement. The transformation was remarkable. What had been basic storage space became a charming studio apartment with vaulted ceilings, large windows facing the ocean, and custom built-in furniture that maximized the available space. Victoria had chosen finishes and fixtures that complemented the main house while maintaining the independence and privacy I needed to feel truly at home. But more importantly, the process of working together on the renovation had changed the dynamic between Victoria and me in ways that legal documents couldn't capture. She began stopping by in the evenings to check on progress and ask my opinions about details, gradually shifting from project manager to something approaching a daughter-in-law who actually cared about my comfort and preference. I learned that Victoria's initial hostility toward my presence had been rooted in insecurity rather than pure selfishness. She'd felt overwhelmed by the expectations of maintaining Richard's family home, while establishing her own family's traditions, and my continued residence had felt like a judgment on her worthiness as Marcus's wife and the twins' mother. Victoria admitted that she'd been especially threatened by the twins' obvious affection for me and their frequent requests to visit Grandma Peggy in the shed, rather than spending time with her in the main house. She'd interpreted their preference as evidence that she wasn't providing adequately for their emotional needs, rather than understanding that children simply enjoyed having multiple adults who cared about them. Our conversations during the renovation period helped me understand that Victoria's financial focus had been motivated more by anxiety about proving herself than by actual greed. She'd grown up in a family where money was equated with success and security, and she'd been genuinely worried that she couldn't afford to maintain the beach house without generating additional income from every available source. Marcus remained somewhat distant during this period, clearly uncomfortable with the legal proceedings and embarrassed about how close he'd come to displacing his own mother. He gradually began visiting me more regularly, often bringing the twins for afternoon activities that reminded me of the relationship we'd enjoyed before Victoria's insecurities and my displacement had created so much tension. The twins were delighted with my renovated living space, immediately claiming the window seat as their preferred spot for reading stories and declaring that Grandma Peggy's house was even better than their new bedroom. Their enthusiasm helped normalize the arrangement for everyone, making it clear that multiple generations could coexist happily when everyone's needs were respected and accommodated. 6 months after the settlement was finalized, Victoria surprised me by asking if I'd be willing to help her plan a party to celebrate the completion of both house renovations. She wanted to invite friends and family to see what we'd accomplished together, and she specifically asked if I would be comfortable being introduced as the family matriarch who'd made it all possible through my generous property gift. The party was everything Victoria had hoped for: elegant but welcoming, sophisticated but family-friendly, showcasing both the main house improvements and my beautiful studio apartment. Victoria made a point of introducing me to every guest as Marcus's mother, and the original owner who'd chosen to remain on the property to be close to her grandchildren. I watched Victoria throughout the evening, observing how she'd grown into the role of hostess and family anchor, without needing to diminish anyone else to establish her position. She'd learned that there was room for multiple strong women in one family, and that sharing influence and respect actually strengthened rather than weakened her authority.
The guests were charmed by the arrangement, with several older couples commenting that they hoped their own adult children would be creative and generous enough to find similar solutions when multi-generational housing became necessary. Victoria beamed at these compliments, clearly proud of what she'd learned to frame as forward-thinking family planning rather than legal obligation. Marcus gave a brief speech during dinner, thanking everyone for celebrating our family's new chapter and acknowledging that finding the right living arrangement had required patience and creativity from everyone involved. He didn't mention the legal proceedings or the difficult months we'd all endured, but his tone conveyed genuine gratitude for the resolution we'd achieved. But the most meaningful moment came when Sophia and Emma insisted on giving their own toast, thanking Grandma Peggy for staying close enough to help with homework and bake cookies whenever they needed comfort. Their simple words captured the real value of our arrangement: family connection across generations, maintained through respect and legal protection rather than charity and uncertainty. As the evening wound down and guests began departing with compliments about the beautiful property and clever living arrangement, I realized that Victoria's phone call 6 months earlier had indeed changed everything. But not in the way she'd originally intended. Instead of successfully evicting an inconvenient elderly relative to maximize rental income, she'd learned to create space for family complexity and multi-generational needs. Instead of choosing profit over relationships, she'd discovered that investing in family security actually enhanced rather than threatened her own position as wife and mother. The legal documents Elena had crafted gave me permanent housing security, but the relationship Victoria and I had built through the renovation process gave me something equally valuable: a place in my family's future that was based on mutual respect rather than grudging obligation. I still lived in what had technically been a storage shed behind the house I'd owned for 30 years, but it was now a beautiful studio apartment that I occupied by legal right rather than family charity. More importantly, it was a space where my granddaughters felt welcome, where my son could visit without guilt or conflict, and where I could age with dignity while remaining connected to the people and place I loved most. The ocean waves that had lulled me to sleep for 3 decades continued their eternal rhythm outside my new windows, but now they sounded like a promise rather than a memory. I was still Margaret Williams, still a widow learning to navigate life without her husband, but I was no longer a burden or a temporary complication in someone else's story. I was family, permanently and legally protected, with my own space and my own rights and my own future to write. And sometimes, when the light hit the water just right and the twins' laughter drifted from the main house, I could almost hear Richard's voice on the wind, telling me he was proud of how I'd learned to fight for myself while keeping our family together. 1 year after the settlement was finalized, I woke to the sound of construction equipment again, but this time, the noise filled me with curiosity rather than dread. Victoria had mentioned something about a surprise project, and when I peered through my bedroom window, I saw workers installing what appeared to be a small gazebo near the property line between my studio and the main house. Marcus appeared at my door that morning carrying a coffee tray and wearing the sheepish expression he'd perfected during childhood when he'd done something he hoped I'd approve of but wasn't entirely certain. He explained that Victoria had been planning this addition for months, wanting to create a dedicated space where the family could gather for meals and conversations without anyone feeling like they were intruding on someone else's territory. The gazebo was positioned perfectly to provide ocean views while maintaining privacy for both residences, with a design that complemented the architectural style of both buildings. Victoria had consulted with the same designer who'd renovated my studio, ensuring that the new structure would enhance rather than compete with the existing improvement. But what touched me most was learning that the twins had specifically requested this addition after overhearing some of their friends comment that it was weird for their grandmother to live in a separate building behind their house. Sophia and Emma had wanted a space that would make it clear to everyone that our living arrangement was intentional and special rather than strange or temporary. Victoria emerged from the main house as the workers began setting foundation posts, carrying architectural drawings, and looking more relaxed than I'd seen her since the early days of our settlement. She spread the plans on my small patio table and began explaining the features she'd incorporated based on observations of how our family actually used the outdoor space. The gazebo would include built-in seating that could accommodate 8 people comfortably, with a table that could be configured for dining or game playing depending on the occasion. She'd planned electrical connections for lighting and a small refrigerator, plus plumbing for a wet bar that would make entertaining easier and reduce trips back and forth to the main house. But the detail that surprised me most was a small library nook with weather-resistant shelving and comfortable reading chairs positioned to take advantage of the ocean breeze and afternoon sun. Victoria explained that she'd noticed how often I sat outside reading in the evenings, and she thought having a dedicated space for that activity would be more comfortable than balancing books on patio furniture. I asked Victoria why she'd decided to invest in this addition, especially given the substantial cost and the fact that our legal settlement didn't require any improvements beyond my studio renovation. Her answer revealed how much her perspective on family living had evolved over the past year. She explained that watching the twins' relationship with me had taught her about the value of multi-generational connection in ways she'd never experienced in her own childhood. Her parents had lived across the country and visited rarely, so she'd grown up thinking that family relationships were primarily obligational rather than genuinely supportive and enriching. Seeing Sophia and Emma benefit from having a grandmother who was available for daily interactions, homework help, and the kind of unconditional attention that busy parents couldn't always provide had changed Victoria's understanding of what family could look like. She'd realized that my presence wasn't competing with her role as mother but actually enhancing it by providing additional stability and wisdom for her daughters. Victoria also admitted that she'd come to appreciate having another adult woman in the family who understood the complexities of managing a household and raising children. Our conversations during the renovation period had evolved into a friendship based on shared experiences and mutual respect rather than the suspicious tolerance that had characterized our early interaction. The gazebo project took 3 weeks to complete, and during that time I watched Victoria manage the construction with the same careful attention she'd applied to my studio renovation. She consulted with me about details like lighting placement and furniture selection, treating my opinions as valuable input rather than polite gestures toward an elderly relative. Carlos Mendoza supervised this project as well, and he commented that he'd never seen a family work so hard to create spaces for connection rather than separation. Most of his clients wanted privacy walls and separate entrances, but Victoria was investing in shared spaces that would encourage interaction while respecting individual needs for autonomy. The day before the gazebo was scheduled for completion, Victoria asked if I would be willing to host the first official gathering in the new space. She wanted to invite Patricia down from San Diego and plan a small celebration that would mark not just the physical completion of the project, but the emotional completion of our family's transition to a new living arrangement. I agreed enthusiastically, and we spent the afternoon planning a menu and guest list that would showcase both the gazebo's functionality and our family's success in creating a multi-generational living situation that worked for everyone. Victoria suggested inviting Elena Rodriguez as well, since her legal guidance had made our current happiness possible. Patricia arrived the morning of the celebration carrying a bouquet of flowers from her garden and a photo album filled with pictures of Richard and me during our early years in the beach house. She'd been documenting our family's journey through this transition, and she wanted to create a visual record of how we'd transformed challenge into opportunity. Elena arrived shortly after Patricia, and I was struck by how different this gathering felt from our first meeting in the coffee shop when I'd been a desperate woman seeking legal protection from her own family. Now we were celebrating the successful resolution of a complex family situation that had required both legal expertise and emotional growth from everyone involved. The twins had decorated the gazebo with streamers and balloons, treating the occasion like a birthday party for a space rather than a structure. They'd also prepared a brief presentation about why they loved having Grandma Peggy living so close, complete with drawings of family activities and a list of reasons why multi-generational living was superior to traditional arrangements. Sophia's list included practical items like always someone home when parents are working and help with homework when mom is busy with Emma, while Emma focused on emotional benefits like hugs whenever needed, and stories about Dad when he was little. Their perspectives reminded all the adults present that this arrangement wasn't just about housing logistics, but about family richness and connection. Marcus arrived home from work to find the gazebo celebration in full swing, and his expression as he surveyed the scene was one of genuine content. He joined our gathering with enthusiasm rather than obligation, participating in conversations and activities with the relaxed engagement of someone who no longer felt torn between competing family loyalty. During dinner, Elena raised a toast to creative problem-solving and family resilience, acknowledging that our situation could have ended very differently if we hadn't been willing to work toward solutions that addressed everyone's legitimate needs. She mentioned that she'd begun recommending our arrangement as a model for other families facing similar multi-generational housing challenges. Victoria surprised everyone by presenting me with a framed copy of our settlement agreement, signed by all parties and decorated with family photos from the past year. She explained that she wanted me to have a visual reminder of our legal protections, but also of the family commitment that had grown alongside those formal guarantees. The evening concluded with the twins insisting on a tour of the gazebo for anyone who hadn't seen all the special features Victoria had incorporated. They demonstrated the adjustable table, tested the sound system that had been installed for outdoor entertainment, and explained the storage areas where games and outdoor equipment would be kept. As our guest departed and the family began cleaning up, I realized that this celebration marked more than just the completion of a construction project. It represented the full integration of a living arrangement that had begun as a legal necessity, but had evolved into a chosen family structure that benefited everyone involved. Over the following months, the gazebo became the natural gathering place for family activities that had previously been awkward to coordinate. The twins did homework there after school while I prepared dinner in my studio kitchen, creating a natural supervision arrangement that helped Victoria manage her work schedule without worrying about childcare. Weekend breakfasts in the gazebo became a family tradition, with Marcus handling pancakes on the built-in griddle while Victoria and I managed coffee and conversation. These meals provided relaxed time for family communication that had been difficult to achieve when everyone was trying to navigate the social dynamics of gathering in either the main house or my studio. The space also proved valuable for entertaining friends and extended family, providing a neutral area where guests could interact with multiple generations without feeling like they were intruding on anyone's private residence. The twins' friends were particularly charmed by the arrangement, often asking if their own grandparents could come live in similar settings. But perhaps the most meaningful use of the gazebo was for the quiet conversations that developed between Victoria and me during evening hours when the rest of the family was occupied with work or school activities. These talks covered everything from parenting strategies to career decisions to the challenges of maintaining marriages during busy family periods. Victoria began asking my advice about situations with the twins, drawing on my experience raising Marcus and my perspective as someone who'd successfully navigated decades of family life. I was careful to offer support rather than criticism, understanding that she needed encouragement rather than judgment as she developed her own parenting style. In return, Victoria helped me navigate the practical aspects of aging in place, researching local services and resources that would help me maintain independence as my needs changed over time. She approached these conversations with sensitivity and respect, treating my autonomy as important while also planning for potential future assistance. The relationship between Marcus and me also continued to heal and strengthen during this period. Our weekly coffee meetings in the gazebo provided opportunities for the kind of sustained conversation that had been difficult to achieve during the crisis period when every interaction was filtered through legal concerns and family tension. Marcus gradually began sharing more about his work stress and marriage challenges, seeking the kind of parental guidance he'd avoided during the early years of his marriage when establishing independence had seemed more important than maintaining family connection. I was careful to listen more than advise, understanding that he needed support rather than solutions. These conversations helped me understand that Marcus's initial distance during my housing crisis had been motivated more by overwhelm than by genuine indifference to my welfare. He'd been struggling to balance competing demands from his career, his marriage, and his children, and adding his mother's housing needs to that list had felt impossible rather than simply challenging. The twins continued to thrive in our multi-generational arrangement, developing the kind of close relationship with a grandparent that many children miss in our geographically scattered modern family. They spent time with me daily, sharing school experiences and friendship dramas with the trust that comes from having an adult who's always available and never too busy to listen. I helped them with homework not just because I was available, but because I enjoyed the intellectual engagement and the opportunity to stay current with educational approaches and cultural changes. Teaching them cooking skills and family history gave me a sense of purpose that extended beyond simply filling time during retirement years. The practical benefits of our arrangement became more apparent as time passed,
and various family crises arose that might have been more difficult to manage without multi-generational support. When Victoria's father had a heart attack and she needed to travel to Phoenix for 2 weeks, I was able to provide childcare and household management that allowed Marcus to maintain his work schedule. When Marcus faced a particularly demanding trial that required long hours and weekend work, I could ensure that the twins maintained their activity schedules and received the attention they needed without Victoria having to manage everything alone. The flexibility of having 3 adults sharing family responsibilities proved invaluable during stressful periods, but beyond practical benefits, our living arrangement provided emotional richness that enhanced everyone's daily experience. The twins had consistent access to stories about their father's childhood and their grandfather's life, creating connection to family history that might otherwise have been lost or forgotten. Victoria gained perspective on parenting and marriage from someone who'd successfully navigated similar challenges, while I maintained purpose and relevance through active participation in family life, rather than passive observation from the sidelines of retirement. Marcus benefited from having his mother and wife develop a genuine friendship rather than the polite tolerance that characterizes many in-law relationships. The reduction in family tension allowed him to enjoy relationships with all the women in his life, rather than feeling constantly pulled between competing loyalties. As our 2nd anniversary of the settlement approached, Victoria suggested that we might want to document our experience for other families considering similar arrangements. She'd been contacted by several people who'd heard about our situation through friends or seen Elena's presentations at elder law conferences. The idea of sharing our story felt both appealing and daunting since it would require acknowledging the mistakes and conflicts that had preceded our current success. But Victoria pointed out that those difficulties were exactly what made our story useful to other families, since most people wouldn't need legal intervention if they planned more thoughtfully from the beginning. We decided to work together on a guide for multi-generational living that would address both the practical and emotional aspects of creating successful arrangements. The project gave us a shared focus that strengthened our partnership while potentially helping other families avoid the crisis we'd experienced. Writing about our experience required honest reflection on what had gone wrong initially and why our relationship had improved so dramatically once legal protections were established and emotional expectations were clarified. We realized that much of our early conflict had stemmed from unspoken assumptions and unclear boundaries rather than fundamental incompatibility. The process of documenting our story also highlighted how much we'd all grown during this transition period. Victoria had evolved from someone who viewed family relationships as competitive to someone who understood the value of collaborative support systems. Marcus had learned to balance autonomy with connection, maintaining his independence while accepting guidance and assistance when appropriate. I had rediscovered my own strength and worth after a period of grief and displacement that had left me feeling invisible and expendable. The legal battle had reminded me that kindness didn't require martyrdom, and that standing up for myself could actually strengthen rather than damage family relationships. Our guide emphasized the importance of formal agreements even within families, since good intentions weren't always sufficient protection against changing circumstances and competing priorities. We recommended legal documentation not because families couldn't be trusted, but because clear expectations prevented misunderstandings that could damage relationships unnecessarily. We also stressed the value of professional mediation when conflicts arose, since family members often struggled to communicate effectively about sensitive topics without neutral guidance. Elena's involvement had been crucial not just for legal protection but for helping us understand each other's perspectives and find creative solutions. The completed guide was published by a small press that specialized in elder care resources, and it generated interest from families across the country who were dealing with similar multi-generational housing decisions. Victoria began speaking at conferences and workshops, sharing our experience and encouraging other families to plan proactively rather than react to crises. Looking back on our journey from conflict to collaboration, I understood that the phone call that had changed everything wasn't just the one I'd made to Elena Rodriguez when I decided to fight for my right. The real transformation had come through dozens of smaller conversations where we'd gradually learned to see each other as allies rather than obstacles. The beach house that had once felt like a battleground between competing visions of family life had become a demonstration of how different generations could support each other while maintaining individual autonomy. The sound of ocean waves outside my studio apartment, still carried echoes of 30 years of memories with Richard. But now it also carried promises of future experiences with grandchildren, who would remember their grandmother as someone who'd taught them that love and strength weren't mutually exclusive. Victoria's initial plan to erase my presence from the property had ultimately led to my integration into family life in ways that benefited everyone more than separate living arrangements ever could have. The shed that was supposed to become rental income had become the foundation for a family structure that generated wealth in connection and support rather than monetary profit. The legal documents that had initially felt like weapons in a family war had evolved into protective frameworks that allowed trust and affection to develop safely. We'd learned that boundaries weren't barriers to intimacy but prerequisites for sustainable relationships, especially when different generations needed to balance independence with interdependence. As I prepared for bed in my beautiful studio apartment that evening, listening to the familiar rhythm of waves that had soundtracked my life for so many years, I felt profound gratitude for the unexpected journey that had brought us to this place of mutual respect and genuine affection. The woman who'd once been dismissed as a burden had become the cornerstone of a family structure that demonstrated how aging parents could remain vital contributors to their children's lives, rather than passive recipients of care. The shed that was meant to disappear me from my family's story had become the foundation for a new chapter that none of us could have imagined when this whole ordeal began. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but they would be faced by a family that had learned to communicate honestly, plan thoughtfully, and support each other through both legal frameworks and emotional commitment. We'd discovered that the strongest families weren't those that never experienced conflict, but those that learned to transform conflict into deeper understanding and stronger bonds. The phone call that had changed everything had taught us all that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is to refuse to accept unacceptable treatment, and that fighting for your own dignity ultimately protects everyone's ability to live with integrity and respect. In the end, my story wasn't really about real estate or legal rights or even family conflict. It was about the difference between surviving and thriving, between accepting what others decided you deserved and insisting on what you actually needed to live with dignity and purpose. And sometimes, when the evening light hit the gazebo just right and 3 generations of my family gathered there for conversation and connection, I could almost hear Richard's voice in the ocean breeze, telling me he was proud of how I'd learned to build bridges instead of walls, and how I'd discovered that true strength sometimes looked like refusing to disappear quietly when the people you loved needed you to stay visible and present in their lives. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.